Oh, host me, please. Make me a host.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Azure Functions Community livestream. I am Shreya. I'm a product manager on Azure Functions, and I work on Python, PowerShell, and tooling. And with me, I have Sam and Paul, so I'll let them introduce themselves as well.
Hey everyone, I'm Sam. I joined the Azure Functions team about a year ago, and I'm working on the networking and deployment experiences. And I'm super excited today to share all about the networking investments that we've been working on so far. Pass it to Paul over.
Hey everybody, I'm Paul Yuknewicz. I've been on the functions team for maybe 2 years, been with Microsoft maybe a couple decades, a little bit more than that. And I'm really excited to be with you today too. The whole team's been working hard on the security initiative this summer. I think we've learned a lot and we've grown a lot, and we're going to show some of those results today with you. Hopefully you can use some of the work.
Awesome. Thank you both. So that was a perfect transition into kind of what we're going to talk to you all about today. So today we're going to talk to you all about security and also networking. So with our team, we've actually created these new quick starts, and I'm going to kind of start off by sharing where you can find those and how you can kind of try them out and get started today. And then I'm going to hand over to Paul and Sam, who are going to do a deeper dive into identity as well as network isolation. So the new samples that we've created, they're secure and scalable, and they really show best practices in creating secure apps. They also leverage Flex consumption, which is our newest hosting plan. They use Vina integration, and they also use the Azure Developer CLI for super easy deployment. So I'm going to show you all how you can kind of find those today. So if you just kind of go to your search engine and type in Azure Functions, getting started, you can click on whatever you see first, and this leads you kind of to our MS Learn main official documentation area. And on the left, you're going to see that there's a lot of quick starts. Let me just zoom in for you all. So it's the landing page, and on the left, you're going to see there's a bunch of different quick starts for all of our stacks. So here, if you click to drop down, you're going to see this new tab that we recently added called Azure Developer CLI, and we have this for all of the stacks. And this is the new quicker start. So you're going to really see some of the newer improvements that we've made in the product. If you're going to use this quick start, you're going to have a much easier deployment experience as well, and it's really easy to find. So highly recommend you try it out and let us know what you think. So this is kind of just an overview of where you can find the docs, but really Sam and Paul are going to do a deeper dive into all of the fun stuff. So I'm just going to go back to the slide deck. And hand it over to you all. Thank you.
All right. I guess let me jump in. So just to take a bit of a deeper dive, thanks, Shreya. What we've been really focused on are probably two main concerns when it comes to securing our function apps and our cloud apps in general. The first one is around using identity as a more secure way to connect to our app and have our app connect to its dependencies. And really, we're doing this instead of using keys and secrets in those connection strings that have those secrets, which they tend to end up on disk, they end up in source code control, they end up in emails, they end up in files, and all these things are vulnerabilities. So by switching to identity, we're on a much more secure pathway to work with our services. And just as a simple rule, when you have the time, like try to eliminate all passwords and even service principals, which also contain secrets. Just try to eliminate them all over time and transition to identity. Now, thinking about our applications, applications run with an identity. And so I think about managed identity as being the right mechanism for that. I'm going to show you this, but when you enable identity, there's really two kinds that we focus on. There's the system assigned identity. I think about this being good for quick cases, quick dev test. It's kind of like you flip on identity and your resource, let's say the function app, just starts. It issues an identity, and that identity can just be used by default, and it's there for the lifetime of the function app. So kind of think about like if you deleted the function app, you've also deleted your identity. So it's good for quick cases. Now, when you want an identity that's a bit more durable, like that identity can survive the lifetime of many application instances. Maybe it's issued by you, maybe it's issued by admins. You want it to stick around, then a user assigned identity is really handy for that. Back in the day, we had like machine accounts and user accounts. This is kind of like that, but it's done the modern, secure way. And so you can create that user assigned identity resource. It can come from a different resource group, even a different sub, and you can apply that identity. And typically, what we like to do as a best practice is we use a single identity to kind of secure the connection between two services or two resources. So let's say function and a storage account, or a web app and a SQL resource. A few more things. You can see on the right-hand side, I have a bit of a JSON blob, and it's showing you that there's three kinds of settings, app settings, let's call them, where the beginning of the string of the name is Azure Web Job Storage. And think of that as your connection name. And then we have that __ syntax, which is kind of like drilling in to that connection object and setting a particular property on it. So we have three properties: account name, client ID, and credential. Now, if you're doing user assigned managed identity, you always need all three of those. The third one is simply called credential, but the client ID kind of is saying, hey, this is the actual user assigned identity I want to use. In the account name, whether you see account name or URI, that's kind of saying like, this is the resource, this is the location, this is the endpoint that I'm using the identity for. If let's say we didn't put in the client ID or the credential, it's going to flip back and assume system assigned identity. So if you want to do something quick, flip on system assigned identity, specify that account name or URI, off you go. You want to use user assigned identity, you need all three of these properties, three of these settings. I think I can see a question. Does the default Azure credential flow also work? And the answer is yes, it does. And we just have to think about what's the default Azure credential kind of in each case. Like, so if I'm on my local machine and I'm logged in with a CLI, it's going to use my login identity, let's say from my CLI or from VS Code. If it's my application, the application is going to use the default credential it sees, and the default credential, and by the way, this one burned me, is always system assigned identity. So if you want to like override what the default is, you want to go ahead and in your token credential, you want to kind of say that use this client ID. And that's where you disambiguate which user assigned identity or which identity you want to use, if not the default, which again will be system assigned. So those are a couple tips and tricks. So once we've got the identity turned on and we start using these identity-based connections, we can then assign, you can think of RBAC roles. RBAC stands for role-based access control. So we're kind of like, we've got our users and we've got our roles, like what kind of role do you have? And there's also IAM, which I think you see in the portal, or access control is the tab. And I'm going to show you in the portal. But we go there and we kind of design, okay, for this identity, which exact role grants do we want to give? And we want to give the absolute minimum. And we want to be wary, like, these days we recommend don't give full control, don't give full admin, like really just give that actual access that it needs. So in this case, with a function app, typically it needs data contributor or it needs data owner. Let's just stick to that. And then, where do we need to use identity? There's like 3 places I always think about. One is the deployment package. So you may or may not know that, functions creates your application in a zip file. We call it the app zip or the package zip. And in Flex consumption, we automatically like upload that to a blob storage. In the other SKU plans, I think oftentimes it'll get uploaded to a file share, and file share is going to have a little bit of a challenge with identity, but you can use this mechanism called run from package equals URL, and then you can also point to a blob container, and that can hold your app. So you'll want to, if you want to use the identity-based deployment, you'll want to use the blob approaches, one of the 2 that I just mentioned, and then you want to make sure that the app has read access to that blob. Then there's Azure Web Job Storage, which is a necessary, I'll call it complication, that functions and the functions runtime has. So, Eamon was teaching me this, but to do runtime scaling that kind of works cross-stamp, there's a bit of state management that the functions runtime needs to do so that we can keep rehydrating your distributed state and do it at scale. So Azure Web Job Storage needs to be there, and your app and your runtime always needs to be able to access that thing. So we set up the Azure Web Job Storage, just as I'm showing in that snippet of JSON, and then you can use your identity to connect to that. So those 2 are like always required. Then the third one, if I'm using HTTP or a timer, let's say, I'm done. Like I don't need additional identities to think about. But once I start using the more interesting kind of event-driven triggers and bindings, let's say event hubs or service bus or durable functions, you start connecting to other services, and you're going to use that identity-based connection string like you see here in the app settings, and you're just going to add additional ones. And again, it's that same pattern of like, here's the URI, here's the client ID, here's the credential. So that's a bit of talking. It might be clear if I go and show you. So maybe I'll switch over to a demo. And don't need to show all the internals here. Okay, so Shreya, can you see my my terminal?
Yes, I can see it. It's perfect.
Okay,
And
great.
then make it like a little bit larger.
A little bit larger, thank you. Yeah, need the feedback. There we go. I can't see you if you're thumbs upping, so you just have
Oh,
to
it's perfect. Yep, it looks great.
Yep, you'll have to vocalize it. Okay, so I'm in a folder. What I want to do is I want to use the new quick start that Shreya mentioned. So again, I'm in the Azure Docs for functions at the root. Scroll down to create your first function, and then we've got these new tabs, and we've always had Visual Studio, VS Code in normal Azure CLI. And now we've got the Azure Developer CLI. This is like the easy way, because you can just use a command like azd up, and it's going to push the entire set of resources, the entire application up to Azure just in one shot. So let's check out this tutorial. And by the way, just go ahead and use a language that makes you happy. Let's use Python for a moment. So we're going to copy the first Azure azd init command, and that's kind of like a clone on steroids. Let's see if you can see it. Move this up just a bit. All right, so we've already got a folder here. Let's just make another one. And we're going to paste that in. And whether I'm using like a bash shell or PowerShell, it's all good. And so I've got that. That was it. I just initialized it. Now let's see what that did. So I can see here it's brought down everything I need for my function. I've got my host JSON. I've got my actual code. I've got a little bit of config. I even have this infra. Actually, the infra, just so you know, is what's going to power that whole deployment, because it can provision and deploy my app. And I can always open this in VS Code. Because functions at the end of the day is about code. And I can see my lovely, like I've got an HTTP GET function, which is to hello world with the GET API. And then I can also have a POST API where I can send a JSON object. This case, you can see it's got name and age, and then we'll just kind of show you the post. So incredibly simple function, because we don't want the function to be complicated. We want to show you the security side. So what I can do from within VS Code or just from my favorite terminal, I'll go back. And all I have to do is say azd up. An up basically packages the app, it provisions all the resources, and it does a deploy. So kind of chains that together. I'm going to pick my subscription. And I'm going to pick a data center. ECUS2 is good. And it's going to sequentially just kind of go through, create my resource group, create the function, create the storage, create the monitoring, create the managed identity. It's going to do all of it. Just to save a little bit of time, I've gone ahead and I've done that just prior to this call. And you can see like the end result, you get the resource group and all the things I mentioned. So now what we're going to do, let's go to the portal. Let's take a peek. All right. And let's back up. So I just happened to do .NET a few minutes ago. Like I said, it works in all languages exactly the same. So just to look at what's going on here, I have my function app. That's kind of the main thing. We know that the storage account is important because we use that for deployment and also for Azure Web Job Storage. So we can see that here. And the third thing I'm going to focus on is we got a managed identity. And this is a user assigned. And remember, user assigned, because it's a separate resource, this thing is kind of independent from the function. It can have its own lifetime. So let's peek at the function itself. And I made this probably too zoomed in, so I can't see my nav. 1 second. Boop, there we go. So if I scroll down in the settings of my function app, we have a tab called identity. And this is kind of saying, hey, this function app, what is it running as? And I could flip on system assigned, which is like, hey, just automatically issue your own identity, or I can use user assigned. And you can see here that that user assigned identity that was minted has been applied as the identity. So now, when I choose the credential for the function app, I can choose this client ID and choose this as my identity. And if I had chosen system assigned, that would be like the default credential. All right, we'll use user assigned in this case. And then let's look at the storage account. Let's look at the storage account. And let's look at the access control, or IAM. That's going to have the RBAC roles. And if I look at the role assignments, you'll see a bit of things going on. But the really key one in this case that we're looking for is storage blob data owner. Now this is on the data plane, like reading and writing, uploading and downloading from a storage blob account. This is the one that gives me access to the actual data. One thing to kind of be aware is, when you're doing data access, you tend to see data in the role, but otherwise there's these administrator and owner and contributor. That's more in the management level. That's like, can I change settings? Can I mint new users, new properties? That's completely different than being a data access owner. So you need that data access owner just for your function. And we don't think you need to. Like, our opinion is you should kind of stay out of the storage account and let functions deal with it. But if you absolutely had it to, let's say for debugging, you could add your own login user. Let's say Paul Yuck at Microsoft.com. I could also add that as a data owner, and now I'm going to have access to the containers and the blobs too. So just some things to keep in mind. Another thing that I think is handy, and I use it for kind of diagnostics, is you can do a check access, and then you could pick a managed identity or a user account. And let's see if I can see it in this view. So here, these would be function system identities. And then for user identities, we want to match up the one that's for this. So the W4VP something. That's kind of the hint we're looking for, because all the tokens match up when we create these. My eyes are not working.
Let's see.
Call it out if you see it.
Yeah, I don't see it in this. Is there more that you can scroll down to?
There might be. It's we have to sort of. Okay, let's do it this way.
Try ST.
W4. There we go.
Okay.
So this is the user assigned identity, and then you can see, oh, it's got storage blob data owner. So if you're ever just unsure, like, do I have for this exact identity, does it have access to this other resource? I think this check access is a lifesaver. And go ahead.
Oh yeah, this is awesome. One question for you. So when you're checking this, how long does it usually take from when the access was granted to it being reflected?
For me, it's really quick. I mean, it's like seconds that I've seen it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, if the function's already running, applying the grant is really fast. Now, sometimes, let's say your function maybe doesn't have an identity at all, so you might want to restart the function, and then you want to wait several seconds after that, maybe 20, 30, to make a major change to the function. But applying an RBAC role is, in my experience, very quick, especially if things are kind of in the same subscription, same resource group. It'll be faster.
Yeah.
Any other ones while I'm here? Oh, there is one more thing I wanted to show you, and I gave you a glimpse of it in the slide. So if we go to the function app again, now remember, like, most all of its configuration to talk to dependencies like storage or your other triggers and bindings, you're going to find those in the environment variables. And I used to be so cautious about demoing this, because right here, like, a connection string might contain a secret, and I'd be exposing it right now to the entire world. Now, the good news is I have less worry because I'm using a managed identity. You don't have my secret. You can't have it. So only I can get it, and it's just persisted here. But what we're looking for is like a connection to a dependency. So that's right here, Azure Web Job Storage. And again, for user assigned identity, we want those 3 settings. Now, let's say it wasn't storage I wanted to connect to. Let's say it's a different dependency. So I've got, let's say service bus. Oh, and here's the tab. So what I want to show you here is if you go to the docs and you go to any trigger, any binding, there's a section of it, and there's like an anchor for it, where if you scroll down, you'll get to connections and identity-based connection. And this will tell you the exact setting you need. So again, you'd have like a connection name. That's going to match up with what you have in code. Like, hey, my connection for this trigger is, let's say, service bus connection. It, by default, is going to want this fully qualified namespace. And as I kind of remember, mentioned before, you're looking for usually something that's like an account name or a URI. And in service bus land, they call it a namespace. Namespace is also a typical value that you'll see. And a lot of things are kind of in the service bus family. So event hubs, event grid will kind of tend to work this way, where you get the __ fully qualified namespace. So just like definitely check out in the triggers and bindings docs. They're pretty good. They will spell out how to do an identity-based connection for every one of the triggers and bindings. And just to demystify this a bit more, Matthew on the team taught me this. This is really the same syntax that's used by all the Azure SDKs. So Azure Functions isn't doing something special here. It's just using a built-in feature of the Azure SDKs. So I don't know if there's any more questions. If not, maybe we'll switch gears and go to Sam. What do you think, Shreya?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Paul. I think one thing I really appreciated is how you incorporated the docs, because it truly is so easy to get started, and we do have a lot of great information out there for our customers. So that's awesome. And then yes, Sam, over to you to talk more about networking.
Sweet, thanks, Shreya. Let's get into networking. So Paul just overviewed all we're doing on the authentication piece. And you might have the question, why do I need authentication and networking? I thought one is good enough. And so a good distinction is authentication restricts access to your resources by who can access it, whereas networking is along the line of what can access it, or what devices are able to access your resources. So both networking and authentication are a two-pronged approach to make sure that you lock down your environment from any bad actors or people who might want to compromise your system. So when we talk about networking, there's two areas that we need to address, and the two are inbound networking and outbound networking. So inbound networking refers to what can access your resource, what sort of guardrails you want to put in place to protect your resource. Whereas outbound networking refers to when my resource makes calls to other resources, to what degree of security should I enforce that channel? So I'll go into the two groups in more detail here. So first, going to inbound networking controls, most Azure resources have a property called public network access. And the values can be either enabled or disabled. When the access is enabled, what that means is anyone can access that endpoint. And if they're authenticated, they can access the data. And so when your public access is enabled, what you want to do is add different layers of security. So prevent certain IPs from accessing it, or prevent certain subnets to access it. Now, if you set it to disabled, what that means is no one can access your resource. And then you have to allow specific private endpoints to reach that resource, which we'll talk about in a bit. So I had mentioned there's certain layers you can add for what can access your resource. And the first layer is IP access restrictions. And this is essentially saying I have a set of trusted IP addresses that I know are allowed to access my resource. So I can list all these IPs and then allow them access to, let's say, my storage account. Service endpoints go one level deeper. Service endpoints essentially says, hey, I only want Azure resources in my virtual network to reach my resource. So this can be, hey, I only want function apps in my VNet A to reach my storage account. So this goes one level granular. We're talking about private network access at this point. Now, private endpoints is really good when it's coupled with a disabled endpoint. So remember, when you disable your endpoint, no one can access your, let's say, storage account endpoint. So the only way you can access to that storage account is through a private endpoint. And essentially, think of a private endpoint as converting one IP address of your VNet into a warp tunnel. If you have access to this private endpoint, you get right into directly a blob sub-resource of a storage account. So it goes one level deeper than service endpoints, because service endpoints means I can access the storage account as a whole. Whereas a private endpoint can go even more granular. I want blob access, or I want file access, or table access, or queue access. So private endpoints is Azure's best in securing your resources. And that's what I'll demonstrate in a bit. Now, I just overviewed the inbound controls. What can access my resource? Now let's talk about outbound networking. And this is important because your function app does have to access other resources. So we want to make sure that when your function app talks to storage or a service bus, it's doing it through the most secure channel. So the first thing I want to talk about is virtual network integration. And what that means is you're allowing your function app to join a virtual network. Or in other words, when your function app makes a call, it will use an IP address from your private virtual network as its source IP. And once it is able to use a source IP in the virtual network, then you can couple that with a service endpoint or private endpoint. So really, a virtual network integration is the first step to securing your function app and have it communicate with your resources in a secure way. Now, NSG rules are interesting. NSG rules are essentially custom rules that you can define to deny inbound or outbound traffic. So you can say, I don't want my function app to ever call out to the internet. That can prevent data exfiltration. So you can add that rule into your subnet that the function app is integrated with. And once you do that, the function app can never make calls to the internet. So if you have that sort of level of security, you can do that. UDRs are a way to define how your function app hops between different resources to get to the end destination. So you might want to force your function app calls to always go through a VNet or a firewall just to have an extra level of security there. Now, I had mentioned that when you join your function app to a VNet, it will use private IP addresses on that VNet. But maybe you want a static IP address that's predictable and that you can account for in your system design. So with that, you can use a NAT gateway. And the NAT gateway essentially allows you to reserve one IP address that your function app can use. So that's a big spread of networking terms. And I'm going to demonstrate or overview what we recommend for you to get started when you create a function app. So let's go to the next slide. And I have this architecture diagram. Because I don't know if you're like me. When I think about networking, it's so hard to fit all the pieces together, the lines and the calls. So I like diagrams here. So let's start on the left side. See, we have a function app here. And in this case, the function app is going to be publicly accessible. Why? Well, we're doing a scenario where we have an API. And maybe we want our customers to be able to reach our API endpoint. So in this case, we want it to be publicly accessible with particular authorization, right? So we have at least one level of security there. So here we have a client machine that's triggering on the function app, and the function app is able to return. But what's important is when the function app makes the backend calls, maybe when it's accessing its code to run, it has to go through a secure channel to reach blob storage where that code is housed. So I'm now going to go to the right side of the function app and talk about the outbound networking configurations. So if you look to the right of the function app, we have a little channel that says virtual network integration. And what that means is every single call that the function app makes is going to go through that virtual network. And the virtual network here is 10.0.0.0/16. So it's a big virtual network. And we're going to splice that virtual network and spin out a subnet for the function app to use. That's going to be 10.0.1.0-24. Essentially, that's 256 addresses that the function app can use. And so whenever the function app makes a call, it will use one private IP address from that subnet there. Now, when it tries to reach storage, it's going to notice that storage has its public endpoint disabled, and that's marked by that black line to the left of Azure Blob Storage. So nobody can reach that blob storage. It's really well secured. So how can we get our function app to reach that blob storage? Well, that blob storage has configured one private endpoint connection, meaning there is one way to get into the warp tunnel to reach that blob storage. And that warp tunnel or that private endpoint is situated within the virtual network. And specifically, the address is 10.0.2.1. So when the function app says, hey, I want to reach this Azure Blob Storage, the Azure Private DNS Zone is going to say, hey, I see that you're trying to reach blob storage. Let's go to 10.0.2.1, and that's actually going to be the key. That's going to actually send you to blob storage. So in other words, because the function app is in the virtual network, it has access to the private endpoint, which is the only thing that's access to the blob storage. And in this way, we make sure that the blob storage can only ever be accessible by the function app. And I think that's a good overview of what we have here. So the function app is inbound accessible, but all the connections to blob storage are going to be through that private channel. So, yep, I think. See, Paul.
And Sam, let me ask you a question. So I don't know as much about networking as you do, but like I have Wi-Fi and routers at home. Is this kind of like that a little bit, where I've got my public internet? That could be a hostile place, but I want my private network with my kids and my family and everyone to be a peaceful place. So I have a bit of a gateway. I have a router, and then I open up firewall ports sometimes, like if I want Xbox to be connected to or something like. Is that an okay analogy to think about here? But maybe just more secure, more enterprise strength.
Yeah, I like that analogy a lot. So in that analogy, if we're relating it to functions, the function app is the router there, and it's protecting the wild west of the internet from your private Azure resources in your virtual network. So in a way, access that gateway into any services that are locked behind that virtual network. Nice.
Cool. Thanks.
Sweet. So we have a lot of theory here. We have a beautiful picture of the network topology. Let's see what that looks like on the Azure portal. So I'm going to go to my screen share, and we're going to go to the resource group. So similar to what Paul did, I did AZD up, and this is everything that you get here. And some of the resources are related to networking. So the first thing we'll do is go to the function app, and we're going to see, hey, we said public access is going to be enabled. Is it? So we're going to hit this endpoint, and we can see that functions is up and running, meaning the app is publicly accessible. And we can confirm this by going to the networking blade of the function app. So down here.
Sam, do you mind zooming in really quickly?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
How's that?
Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. So we have this section here called inbound traffic configuration. And here we have public network access. As we can see, it's enabled with no access restrictions. And if you did want to add more networking restrictions later, you can go into there and then add your own custom rules here as well. But for the sake of this scenario, we're pretty okay with this configuration. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is outbound traffic configuration. And here we see that the function app is joined to a virtual network, and it's linked here. So we have this virtual network that was created for us by AZD, and we see that it's joined to the subnet called app. And what's interesting is in the subnet, we have this property called a delegation. And what a delegation means is you're allowing us, the platform, to allocate IP addresses from your subnet to the function app. So you really need to allow this delegation for the virtual network integration to work. And fortunately, when you configure VNet integration with our client tools, we'll do all that configuration for you. So going back, we can also see links to NAT gateway, network security group, and user-defined routes. So for the basic scenario that we're demonstrating in our AZD samples, we have those requirements. You can do them here through these links. So that's an overview of the function app networking. But what's also very important is how we're configuring the storage account, because the storage account is that resource that we want to make sure that no bad actors can get into. So for that, I'm going to go into the storage account resource that was created. And I'm going to go to the networking blade. And the networking blade is really good because it gives you an overview of the state of networking for your Azure resources. So here we see that public network access is disabled. And if you recall, that means no one can access this storage account endpoint. And we can confirm that there's hope because we have a private endpoint connection. So because of the private endpoint connection, we can get into the storage account. So let's test this out. Let's say I'm a bad actor who somehow got control over storage blob data contributor. So as Paul mentioned, we gave the identity access to the data, but I maliciously added myself and I want to get into the data. So I'm going to go to containers and try to get access to the code here. Well, when I get in, I see that I'm blocked. I'm not authorized to perform this operation, which means that even though I have authentication to access the data, I don't have the networking configurations for it. So again, this is that illustration of the two-pronged approach to securing your data here. So that's pretty cool. How does this all work? We had mentioned that this is all enabled through a resource called the private endpoint. That's the warp tunnel that's doing all the magic. So if we go back to the resource group, you'll see that there's a couple interesting resources. We have this private endpoint resource, we have a private DNS resource, and we have a network interface card. And in the next couple minutes, I just want to make sense of what these new resources are doing in your resource group. So let's go into the private endpoint resource and go to DNS configurations. So here we see that it's joined to a network interface. And a network interface is just a means for your resource to access the virtual network. And the network interface has reserved a private IP address 10.0.1.4, which means that this private endpoint is given the IP address 10.0.1.4. Now, to your app, 10.0.1.4 doesn't really mean anything. It's just an address, which is why we introduced this idea of private DNS zones. So here we see we've mapped the storage account's fully qualified domain namespace to the private IP address. So when the function app is trying to call and access the storage account name, the DNS zone is going to say, hey, go to this warp tunnel 10.0.1.4, and then you can access it. So the map is the DNS zone. And here we see that the DNS zone is only linked to this virtual network, meaning if you're outside this virtual network, you won't have access to the DNS zone, so you won't have access to the knowledge of that private endpoint. And that's really good because this ensures that only resources within the virtual network can access the private endpoint and thereby access the storage account. So that's all the resources related to networking that we automatically create for you with the AZD. And after looking at all these configurations to configure networking on inbound and outbound, as well as inbound on the storage account, there's a ton. And that's why I'm really grateful for all of the team's work, especially Shreya, on the AZD samples that we've been providing for you so that you don't have to worry so much about fine-tuning all of these configurations. You can get started with the basic network security that we recommend to everyone. So with that, I'll pass it off to Shreya.
Actually, I have a quick question for both of you. So, I mean, this is so easy. I'm like trying to believe how easy it is. But like, is there, if I want to see the code or how we did this, is there, can I see this configuration? Can I like reuse some of these building blocks for my own apps?
Yeah. That's Shreya, go for it.
No, I mean, I was gonna pass it to you since you have, you're sharing your screen right now. But yes, the code is available. We have samples for all of the stacks, so you can really take what you need from there and use it for your existing apps or for new apps that you're creating. And I think Sam is pulling that up right now, so you can kind of take a look at that. But that's a great question, Paul.
Because Azure Dev CLI or AZD, if I understand it right, it's actually backed by a bunch of Bicep infrastructure as code. So like I assume that's somewhere that I could use.
Yeah, it's actually, Sam, if you go all the way up, sorry.
Okay.
And you'll see the words template repository a little bit lower.
I think it's right under where you do the init, the AZD init.
Yep,
Oh,
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Awesome. And this brings us to the Azure repo, this GitHub repo that has all the Bicep, right? Containing how to get this spun up.
Is that what that infra folder is?
I think so. Oh, there we go.
There it is.
Cool.
Awesome.
So that's cool. So I could customize this, or I could just take the hunks of it that, make sense.
Yeah, exactly. Like this is a great starting point or even an end-to-end app. But yeah, when you're making your own, you're going to want to take pieces from this. And like Sam said, we want to make it as easy for y'all. So being able to leverage this existing code will hopefully take away some of that extra work that comes in when starting from scratch.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sam and Paul. I have this last slide that just kind of has some of the resources that you all can use. Awesome. So just going to share that. Oopsies. Okay. There we go. So yes, we have all of these great docs that, Paul, Sam, and me, we kind of talked about. We showed you all how you can find them. But more importantly, I think really appreciate Paul and Sam that you're able to go in and kind of play with the app and show us really like what all of the resources mean, how to navigate and make these changes in our own apps. So really, really appreciate that. I think we have some great documentation. Now we have this as well that kind of demos exactly how you can get started. So we really ask you all, if you can, please try this out, modify your apps, try our end-to-end quick starts. Let us know what feedback you all have. And I see on the resources, Paul has volunteered to also be a resource for you all. So feel free to
I think you voluntold me, Shreya. This is great.
Yeah.
I appreciate your faith. Yeah.
Yes, a lot of faith in, of course, in that. And then, we're all available to you all on GitHub, as well as we're on Twitter as well, Azure Functions. So please interact with us. Let us know what you think. We're just here to make the experience better for you all, and we want to really do everything that we can to make this process easier and make sure that you all have the resources to make your apps as secure as possible. So thank you so much for joining our community stand-up. Any last thoughts, Paul, Sam?
Well, it's been a lot of fun. It's definitely a journey, and like internally in Microsoft, we're in this initiative to be more secure. You might have heard about it. We call it SFI, and we go through waves. So I feel like every wave we're getting a little bit smarter, and so I wouldn't be surprised if Sam and I and you and the team, we just kind of keep updating these, and like this is not something that's going away. We're going to get better and better.
Yes, definitely. This is just like a step in the right direction, step in the process. So that's why, your feedback is really important. Yeah.
I put it in the chat. There's one other thing I want to say. Like, if you look at this and you're just saying, "Holy moly, that's so much work I have to do for all my functions." Just keep in mind, we're showing you best practices if you want to be the most secure posture possible today, right? But I think, take the pieces that work for you. Maybe like focus on identity first. You don't have to go all the way into VNet. We're just showing you the most secure case, but don't feel like urgency that you have to do it all, tomorrow. It certainly has taken us a bit of time.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's really about like taking what you might need right now and like knowing these best practices, especially with new development, and so on and so forth.
Yep. Yeah, especially new development. Hopefully, it's kind of nice to like get in shape, stay in shape, kind of a thing. And then we all have, I think, existing apps or legacy, and that takes a bit more time.
Yes, definitely. Awesome. Thank you all so much again. So until next month, see you all then.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Bye.